Welcome to this video on Remains, one of the poems in the Power and Conflict selection for paper 2 on your English literature. Now, as with the other videos, I will assume that you have already read the poem, so pause the video here and make sure that you read through the poem twice. I've picked out some of the key quotations that we're going to be looking at, so you might also want to highlight some of these key phrases on your copy of the poem. So firstly, let's just think about the title, Remains. They could have two meanings here. So it could mean the physical remains of the body, but it could also mean what remains, as in what is left behind. And for the speaker in the poem, that's the kind of mental impact of his actions, the memories. So there's these two different meanings here to the title. Let's just have a look at some of the background to the poem. And the two key things really that you need to know is that it's based on a real event from the Iraq War. It's part of a selection of poems that Simon Armitage wrote, all doing with discharged servicemen, so men who had been to war and then left or finished their service for whatever reason. And this poem gives us the perspective of Guardsman Tromans. An essay is based on a real event during the Iraq War. Now, you don't need to write any of this down in terms of the summary, but it is important that you know it's based on the Iraq War, that it's based on a real event and, from a specific soldier's perspective. So essentially, what Armitage did was he collated all these stories from different servicemen and then he turned them into poems. And this is the event that this poem is based on. So 3 soldiers were called to clear a bank that was being looted by some people in Iraq, and one of the looters ran out. And in the poem it says that he was probably armed, but possibly not. So all 3 soldiers who were there then shot him and killed him. And they shot him multiple times. And then the man was taken away, but the bloodstain remained on the ground. And the soldier saw it week after week when he was on patrol. And it's sort of, almost like I think he describes it as his blood shadow, this kind of reminder of what he'd done. Tromans then goes home from the war. He's on leave, but he can't get rid of the image of the man he shot. And it kind of replays in his head. And he turns to drink and drugs to try and forget it, but he can't. And so really it's starting to look at the longer effects of being at war and the impact that it has on the individual. Let's start to have a look at the poem itself then, but make sure that you've at least got those 2 bullet points about the context, being in the Iraq War and from the perspective of Guardsman Tromans, and those couple of ideas about the title. Okay, in verse 1 they arrive on the scene. Again, you don't need to write down the summary bit in this box at the top. That bit is not important, but what is important are all these notes here. So let's just think about the form of the poem. It's a dramatic monologue like My Last Duchess. We've got someone speaking directly to us and it's in first person. Now it starts off in past tense, we got sent out, but really it's all in present tense. It says one of them legs it up the road. And this present tense gives us this sense that he's kind of reliving the experience as he tells his story. Maybe he's like talking to a counsellor or something like that, but he's almost having to speak through this trauma that he's experienced. And as he does so, it's almost like he's reliving it. The poem starts in media res with the phrase on another occasion. Remember, that means when something starts in the middle of the action. And we want to try and give layers of meaning. So this is a good quotation to be able to use here, because I've noted down 2 possible effects that this might have. Firstly, the in media res is confusing and disorientating for the reader. Now this mirrors the soldiers' experience of going to war that they are not mentally prepared for. So in this way we could read this as a bit of a criticism of the government, sending, or the army, sending soldiers to war that they're not ready for. But we could also say that the confusion and disorientation of this in media res reflects the soldiers' feelings of PTSD, which stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so we've got 2 layers of meaning there, and we're really explaining the effects in detail. We then could zoom in on an individual word and we could say another. So in this quotation, on another occasion, suggests that this has happened before. And this reminds us of what our expectations of soldiers, that they go out and face these things repeatedly, and they're repeatedly exposed to traumatic situations. Then he says we got sent out. And again, this is just really clear suggestion that he's following the orders, just like in Charge of the Light Brigade, where the soldiers were following the orders and they felt that they maybe couldn't question that. We'll look at the word legs later, but we talk about this informal language here, or what we call colloquial language, and we'll pick that up later. But then in the last line, he's describing the looter, and he says he's probably armed, possibly not. Now, we could say that this line makes it seem like Dromius doesn't really care about the looter, whether he's armed or not. Another point of view, another perspective might be that he's starting to doubt his memory now that he's sort of reliving it. He can't really remember whether he was armed or not. So maybe he only realises this when he's looking back with hindsight, which, if you look back with hindsight, means you sort of the benefit of time, you can reflect. But what we could say here is that as the reader, we understand the demands and the pressures put on soldiers. He didn't have time to actually, check properly whether he was armed or not. He had to make a quick, snap decision, because otherwise the consequences of taking too long to make that decision could have been disastrous for the soldiers. And again, this line is going to be significant later on, so we'll come back to that later. Pause the video now, make sure you've got all of those notes related to verse 1. In verse 2, he introduces the other soldiers and they shoot the looter. So he says, well, myself and somebody else and somebody else. And really what he's trying to do here is sort of deflect the blame from himself. It's not just him. And this idea is repeated throughout this verse. All three are all of the same mind, so almost suggesting that they're all agreeing that they're not doing anything wrong. All three of us open fire, three of a kind. Again, so they're all thinking the same way, letting fly. And this makes it almost seem fun, that they're just letting the bullets fly out of their gun. But the main idea here is this idea of him not taking responsibility for what he's done. The somebody else is repeated. Somebody else, somebody else. And this phrase then dominates the line and therefore reduces his own role in the event. So this is where we get this idea that he's sort of saying, well, we all did it. It wasn't just me. And he's not really taking responsibility for what he's done. Another way of looking at this, especially because it says we're of the same mind and we're three of a kind, is that they're programmed to think in a certain way. That's just the way soldiers have to behave. So again, we get a sense of the pressure on them as well. At the end of the verse, he says, and I swear, and then it stops. And the sentence carries on not only into the next line, but into the next verse. Now, this is an important point in terms of structure. This technique is called enjambement, where the sentence carries on into the next line. But this is almost exaggerated here because it carries on into the next verse as well. And you might even want to say that this is a bit of a volta, a turning point in the poem, because this is the point where he kills the soldier, the looter, and then his life changes forever, because ultimately he then can never forget what he does at this point. So the break in the line here and the break in the verse really emphasises this moment in time. At this point, when they're killing the looter, they physically ruin the looter's life. He dies, but he also ruins his own life mentally. And the break in the line and the break in the verse could mirror how the soldier or the speaker has become a broken man after this point, because this memory keeps going over and over in his head, sending him into a sort of spiral of depression. Now, pause the video here, make sure you've got those notes on the structural feature, I swear, the enjambement there, and the notes on that first line. In verse 3, we get again this sense that actually he's sort of having a flashback and he's reliving the experience. He says, I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. And it's almost like he's having an out-of-body experience. He's watching it over and over again. And he can't unsee what he's seen. So this repetition kind of reflects the kind of way that this image keeps coming back to him. And he describes the body of the looter on the ground, and he says he's sort of inside out. Now this language is really vague. He's sort of inside out. Well, is he inside out or not? And really the idea that we get here is Tremens, he can't fully describe what he's done. He can't fully describe the true horrors of war. And he's got almost like a sense of disbelief at what he's seeing. He can't explain it. It's inexplicable, which gives us the idea that he's not really prepared for the harsh reality of killing someone. And And again, this is creating a lot of sympathy for the soldiers. Pause the video here and make sure you've got those notes down. And then he goes on to describe in verse 4 how they get rid of the body. Remember, you don't need to write this bit down here. You just need to write these notes here. And so essentially what they do is they've shot him in the stomach and all of his guts have spilled out of his body. So one of his mates, one of the other soldiers, pushes them back into his body, and then they just dispose of the body on the back of a lorry. And it all seems very matter of fact here. And the language is really important in giving us this experience. So we're going to focus in on the word tosses here. And the way he tosses the guts back into the body is quite disrespectful almost. It's quite careless, as if this looter is like a piece of rubbish. But we could also then look at the sort of type of language that's being used here. And we often call this colloquial language. Colloquial language just means your everyday, casual kind of language, slightly more informal. And I've just listed some examples here of where we see it in the poem. So where he said in the first verse about him legging up the road. I think in verse 2 he says, well, so, sort of, refers to the soldiers as mates. And so all of this makes it seem very ordinary what he's doing. And the reality is to the soldiers it is ordinary. It was their day-to-day life. That's what they had to do. But it juxtaposes the reality, the horror of what they're actually being asked to do. And this kind of what we call incongruence, where things don't really feel like they match up. Can feel quite unsettling for the reader that he's talking about something really violent and really distressing, but he talks about it with such everyday colloquial language. So maybe we can think about what's the message here. Maybe this is reflecting the way that we expect soldiers, that should have an S on the end there, to just deal with their experiences. We just expect them to be brave. We expect them to just treat it like something normal. Reflected by this use of everyday language, when actually it is something much more distressing. Pause the video here, make sure you've got all those notes linked to that phrase, tosses his guts. In verse 5, the soldier returns home, and he starts by saying, end of story, except not really. Now that end sort of reminds us of the end of the looter's life, and the fact that actually it doesn't end at all, not really, because he keeps reliving the memories. And we're going to focus in on this last line, then I'm home on leave. So he kills him, he thinks that should be the end of him. He still sees the mark of blood on the floor, and he walks over it all the time, and it's sort of already starting to relive in his mind. And then eventually he goes back home. Now we've got this full stop in the middle of the line here, and this is called a caesura. Okay, this would be then followed by this bit being enjambement because there's no full stop at the end of the line. So this line then carries on into the next line. But we're not interested in that one. We want to focus in on this caesura here. So remember, a caesura means a break in the middle of a line. And we can see that with that full stop. And this short sentence and full stop maybe symbolises the kind of closure and finality. Now he's at home, he's able to leave the death of the looter behind, he's able to, doesn't have to see the mark of blood on the floor anymore, and maybe now he'll be able to move on. So we can write about what we can infer from that line overall, but again, we want to then zoom in on particular details. So the fact that he's home, the noun home here maybe symbolises safety. He's not in the war zone anymore. But then we've got the phrase on leave. So he should be leaving these things behind. And this is ironic because he can't leave his memories behind. So he's physically on leave, but mentally and metaphorically, he's not able to forget work and forget the things that he's done when he was at work. And so these memories and experiences that he had when he was out fighting in the war are now starting to invade his home life. So we've got this again, we'll see this later where the kind of military language comes into the home life, but that's how these memories feel to him. Pause the video, make sure you've got your notes on that last line. In verse 6, he's still at home and he's now haunted by the memory of what he did. And so we see that the looter sort of bursts again through the doors of the bank. And you can almost imagine this guy like, waking up, as if from a nightmare, where he's sort of reliving this moment over and over again. And this is where we see the repetition of this line, probably armed, possibly not, that we saw in the first verse. So Armitage is using a circular structure here by repeating this phrase. And we get the idea that the trauma of war is never over. He keeps reliving this memory. And maybe he fixates on this point because there's a sense of regret here. And this idea of doubt that we talked about before, that possibly this looter wasn't even armed and they didn't even need to kill him, is now what's playing on his mind. Maybe the looter, he wasn't completely innocent because he was looting a bank, but he wasn't actually maybe carrying a weapon. But he'll never know that. So we get a real strong sense of regret here when he repeats this line. And we get the idea that these memories are inescapable for him. So he then turns to the drink and the drugs in order to try and forget. And he says the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. We're going to zoom in on this verb flush here. When we think of something flushing, we might think of like flushing out a fever, or when you're ill, you want to drink lots of water to kind of get rid of something out of your body. So maybe we've got this idea that he's sort of sick and trying to flush out the memory. But it could also mean this idea of like trying to get rid of something, when you want to flush away something unpleasant. And it makes us think of the idea of water, this idea of him wanting to cleanse and purify himself. Now think about what we've done in Macbeth here, where we talk, the quotation, "A little water clears us of this deed," because there's other references here as well in this poem to Macbeth, and this idea of water being cleansing and purifying, making you innocent, and then blood symbolising the opposite of guilt. Pause the video here, make sure you've got all the notes down that you need. Verse 7, he's still at home, and we can see here where military and home life are really starting to blur. He says that the memory is here in his head when he closes his eyes, and he says it's dug in behind enemy lines. Now, enemy lines makes us think of the military, and he's still using this military language even when he's at home, which is suggesting that the effects of war are inescapable even when he's away from the war zone. We might want to zoom in on the word dug here, which suggests that the memory is very secure. He's not able to get rid of it. It's sort of stuck and buried deep. And then finally we've got verse 8. It's only 2 lines long compared to the other verses, which are all 4 lines long. And at this point he seems to accept what he has done. So there's a shift in the perspective here. Remember at the beginning, he was saying it was all 3 of us, myself and somebody else, and they were all in it together. Whereas here he says, his bloody life in my bloody hands. And the pronoun my really focuses on him just as an individual person. And he seems to be facing the consequences of what he's done alone. Maybe the others are able to move on, but he's not been able to. Let's look then at the quotation in a bit more detail. He starts off by saying his bloody life. Now this is a bit of a pun, which is a play on words. In one sense, his life is literally bloody because he was shot 12 times and all of his guts spilt out of his body and his blood was left on the road. But it's almost like cursing or swearing here. He's saying, his bloody life. So it almost feels like he's sort of suggesting that he feels like he's been cursed by what he's done. And then he repeats the word bloody when he's talking about his hands. He accepts that he has the other man's blood on his hands. And just like in Macbeth, we know that this is a symbol of guilt. Lady Macbeth says to Macbeth, "My hands are of your colour, but I shame to wear a heart so white." And here we can see he's sort of acknowledging the blood on his hands, which is at him acknowledging his guilt and his role in the man's death. And again, just like in previous points of the poem, this repetition of the word reminds us of how this memory keeps on repeating. We'll talk a little bit when we look at structure as well as to why this verse is only 2 lines long compared to the others. But make sure you've got all those notes on verse 8. So a few key points to make about structure, some of them that we've already covered. The verses and the poem overall doesn't seem to have any rhyme, so this could suggest the kind of chaos and lack of control, or chaos in the war zone, and then also the man's lack of control of his emotions or over what's happened. You know, he was just following orders, he did what he was told, and now he has to live with the consequences. Enjambement is a structural feature. Remember we looked at that line, I swear, and caesura as well. Then I'm home on leave, and the impact of that full stop in the middle of the line. So just make sure you've got those notes on those two things, because they're really, really important. And if you haven't, go back and make sure you get them from the video earlier on. The verses are generally all 4 lines long. We call that quatrains, okay, as in quad. And this suggests the way that the military maybe is very ordered. However, the last verse is only 2 lines long. This idea that it's been cut short is like the man's life, the looter's life, okay, that was also cut short. Maybe also we could say that the last verse being shorter creates a sense of there not being any closure. The poem doesn't end the way that we expect. You know, the soldier's experience didn't end the way he expected. He expected that, you know, he would just go and do his job and that would be it. And so this kind of breakdown of the structure, the fact that it's not following the pattern that we're expecting, could mirror the soldier's own mental breakdown. So there's quite a lot that you can say about the fact that this verse is only 2 lines long. Make sure you've got those notes down somewhere then on your copy of the poem. So now let's just think about the writer's ideas. Again, you might want to jot down some of these key words. Maybe Armitage is trying to make a social commentary here and raise awareness of post-traumatic stress disorder and create sympathy for the soldiers. He was writing at a time when the public opinion was changing on the Iraq War, and so he wanted to probably again influence that and get people to realise that we shouldn't have been there fighting. There was a lot of opposition. A lot of people felt that the war was unnecessary. A lot of people felt that it was a war to do with just trying to take seize oil from Iraq, and so therefore was really about greed. But ultimately caught up in all of this were the soldiers who were fighting somebody else's war. Maybe Armitage wanted to reveal the true horrors of war. I've written that twice, I've just realised there, so you can say reveal or highlight, and expose the effects of conflict. And maybe he wanted to also contrast the mental effects of our physical actions. So, you know, we see this all the way through the poem, that the soldier carries out these physical actions thinking that everything's going to be okay, but really it's the mental effects that are the long-lasting ones. So again, just note down those key ideas so you can write about the writer's perspective, why he wrote the poem. In terms of themes then, it's quite straightforward. Obviously it's about war, it's about soldiers, it's about the effects of conflict and war, and it's about internal conflict. You might also want to write about the individual. I haven't put on power there, but you know, the power that an individual has to kind of change the course of their life. So you definitely could link it to the theme of power. It also links with loads and loads of poems, often for the sort of same reasons really. Poppies, we see the psychological consequences of war. And we see that in War Photographer and Exposure and Bayonet Charge as well. In Charge of the Light Brigade as well, we have the consequences of war and this idea of other people, you know, fighting someone else's war and kind of just following someone else's examples. And in Kamikaze, we see the effect of war on home life. And again, we also see that in Poppies and War Photographer as well. So it does compare with a lot of poems really well. Remember, this slide is really good for you to use for your revision, okay? So once you've got all the notes down on the poem, you might leave this slide up or take a picture of the prompts or put them on a flashcard and see if you can use them to write about or talk about the poem in detail. Can you say something for each one of those 10 prompts? And then same with the quotations, they're the things that you need to learn. So can you, using that list, say as much as you can about each of those quotes? And then finally, there's a series of questions here. So again, this is a good place to pause and see how many of those questions that you can answer. You might do it the first time using your notes, and then the second time you might do it without your notes. And then very last thing, remember it is not enough just to make some notes on the poem. Use the revision strategies here to practice your revision. Right, that's everything on remains. Hopefully you've got all of that down. Remember, the video is always there. It's also available on YouTube as well as on the school area, so you can watch it as many times as you like.